This time we will have a kind of strategic overview of how this world, our world, looks from a strategic distance. And I also said that that is really the job of a diplomat, to look at the world not in terms of events and dates and who said what at what place, but to try to detect the underlying trends and tendencies so that he can come to a kind of strategic perspective view about what is this world about, which can then inform the policy people who have to act on that. So that's for today. It's not the conflict cycle. Next week we'll have conflict cycle number 1, and you remember that I made that cycle indeed. I bring that a little bit closer to where I am, although I like to move around, as you have seen last week. The conflict cycle, interruption, pre-conflict, post-conflict, preventive diplomacy and all that kind, ultimate negotiations before you go to have recourse to the use of force, that is use of force, and then post-conflict with rehabilitation, conciliation, constitution drawing, and then kind of a total settlement of the conflict. That's the post-conflict. That's the use of force period, which is a small but intense period because this processes take a lot of time. And that is what we will do in session number 4. Session number 3 is next week, pre and post-conflict. Session number 4. I may also say at some stage something on what is the state, just the concept of a state, because many people get a little bit confused in terms of there are non-state actors and then there are international organizations, there are celebrities, and in the literature generally there is some tendency to inflate non-state actors, to inflate non-traditional processes. I can tell you from my experience, my sober, simple experience, that is that the state remains center stage in everything which is related to international relations, to diplomacy and that kind of things. So we should not underestimate the state. You know, there was already talk about the post-state era, the post-territorial era and all that kind of postmodernist stuff. I'm slightly critical about that. So we may be saying something on the state. We will also say something when we look at pre- and post-conflict arrangements about what we call track 2 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy, that's the kind of standard orthodox diplomacy conducted by foreign ministries, diplomats and so on. Track 2 is indeed the diplomacy which is somewhat more discreet, confidential, sometimes in places which are not very open to the public. It's mediation, it's conciliation, it's good offices, sometimes carried out indeed through non-state actors, think tanks, NGOs and that kind of stuff. So we may be saying something on that as well. So I continue, that's section 4. We are now at 2. 3 is pre and post, 4 is use of force, and then 5 and 6 will be exclusively devoted, as I said last week, to skills, because you remember I spoke about what is diplomacy about. There are different approaches, the descriptive approach, which is the kind of international relations approach, Kissinger style, the normative approach, which is the approach which a lawyer or from an ethical point of view, you look at international relations, that's the normative approach. And that's not without importance, because norms, of course, have a very important role to play in diplomacy, because they set the standards within which you work. For instance, here we will speak about jus in bellum, jus in bello. That is the law which both allows you to use force and the law which governs the actual use of force, which is something else, of course. which is sometimes called today humanitarian law. So the normative approach is an important one. The third one was the analytical approach of diplomacy, and that's more like theory of international relations, international theory, with realism, idealism, and so on. We said something on that. And the fourth approach was the approach of what is diplomacy? Well, diplomacy is simply what a diplomat does. And what a diplomat does requires, among others, a set of skills. Public speaking, negotiation, mediation, drafting of texts, speech writing, speech delivery. Speech writing, speech delivery are totally different jobs. They are almost the opposite one of another. And because they are the opposite of one another, so many speeches are bad speeches, because they have been written, and it is a written text that has to be orally delivered. And these are two total different ways of communication. And that so often leads to a shortcut between speech delivery and speech writing. Okay, so that's again the menu. I just wanted to have the record straight. The people who are organizing these sessions have been informed that there was apparently a miscommunication. Last week, as I told you, and I'm not going to repeat what we said, but basically we kind of cleared the field. What is diplomacy about? I thought about the four approaches: the descriptive, the normative, the analytical, and the practical, which I would like to call the pragmatic approach. As far as the pragmatic approach, that is, what does a diplomat actually do? We said he's an analyst, he's a policy shaper, a strategist, a tactician, a problem solver, a negotiator, and some things more. We also said that we would like to have, or that it is useful to have, an interdisciplinary approach. And again, I know interdisciplinary, it smells so nice, it's so good. Everybody is multidisciplinary, multidimensional, interdisciplinary, but I definitely mean what I say. When you look at diplomacy, you should not just read the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Economist now and then. You also should think about those things from a slightly scientific point of view, because it makes your analysis much more rigorous than simply words and words and words. And as you know, diplomats have a tendency to be a little bit verbose, as some people say. Whereas rigorous, yes, sometimes inspired by science approach can be useful, and that is why I stress the interdisciplinarity. I referred to decision theory, acting under uncertainty, expected utility of certain courses of action that is well worked out in decision theory. Game theory, I gave a couple of examples: dictator's game, the prisoner's game, of course, with which you are familiar. Discourse theory, social psychology, cultural anthropology, which we will certainly encounter when we go to the skills, because one of the basic elements of a good negotiator is to be able to enter into the mind of his opposite, of his antagonist, as we sometimes say, protagonist, antagonist. Enter into his mind, try to decode his reasoning so that you can properly play on that reasoning. Without an understanding of who your foe is, you never can be a good negotiator. And that is where cultural anthropology is very important, to understand the culture and the mind of another. And I spoke about a little book, I think, which is called indeed significantly The Geography of Mind. And I said something about the Western mind and the East Asian, the Asian mind more generally. Behavioral economics with the traps and that kind of thing. That is what we did last week. We said something, but as the time was short, on the kind of two basic approaches, the realist approach, the liberal approach. I don't come back to that, because my understanding is that that is being covered in quite a lot of other courses. Now, for today, we have that ambitious undertaking of looking at the world as if it was just over there, and kind of basically try to say, what is important now in this world. And again, not dates and events and not Trump this and Mr. Orban that, although that plays in the background, but really the underlying trends, the big lines, the red lines of this world. And I'll do that in 7 chapters, but just to have the discussion get off, let me stress again that what we are aiming at is having a bird's eye view of the world, distancing away of the conjunctural developments, but really looking at the underlying strategic shifts. And when you look at that in this way, you have quite some observers who say that currently we live in times of transition and turbulence. I just give these labels to give you a kind of the climate in which we seem to live. We'll test that out, but so that you get a feeling about what do people think about this world. And some exaggerate. I spoke about dramatization and told you that the good diplomat is the reverse of a dramatizing person. He de-dramatizes. He tries to have as cool a view of what is there. And so the labels that I now share with you they come from the think tank world, which is already a little closer to the journalistic world. And as I also said last week, the journalist lives by dramatization and the diplomat lives by de-dramatization. But times of transition and turbulence. Disorder, this was one of the topics of the German Marshall Fund forum. Each year they have a Brussels forum here, a rather prominent affair, I must say, which they try to be competitive with the Munich Security Conference. And the title last year was A World of Disorder. A world of flux. Flux, that is that element of fluidity. You don't know where it goes in all directions. And the one which I prefer comes from the ICG, the International Crisis Group, which also has its main seat, its headquarters here in Brussels, at the Avenue Louise. They use the term strategic unease, and that's the one which pleases me most of that kind of qualifications of the world we are living in. You can you can wrap it up with 2, I think, key concepts. That is, that we are currently living in a world of uncertainty and unpredictability. And that is something which was already true a couple of years ago. I mean, we didn't wait for Trump for this world to become uncertain and unpredictable. But certainly the US president didn't contributed to that uncertainty and unpredictability. And that unpredictability, for instance, explains why you can face surprises, as we somehow faced a couple of months ago with the launch of nuclear ballistic tests by the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. So that is a little bit where we are. We kind of get away from the rules-based world order, and we get into a world of uncertainty and unpredictability. And I would like now to identify 6, 7 underlying trends. And I just mentioned them by means of introduction. First trend is what I would call the diffusion of power. The second one is the fragmentation of norms and values. Diffusion of power, fragmentation of values. The third one is the return of bilateralism as contrasted to multilateralism. The fourth one shouldn't be stressed too much, but it's the kind of short-termism is in the lift again. Short-termism has always been around in politics, but it's stronger now than it was in the past. No world leadership anymore. We are looking for the world leader. Who is leading this world? Who assumes responsible leadership? Who wants to put his neck out, as we say in my language, which is Dutch, my mother tongue, I mean. growing isolationism. So there is a kind of repli sur soi, a kind of inward-looking tendency, quite a lot of countries. And I would end with the kind of wrapping up point of the return of power politics. And that is quite clearly even the European Union, which in the name of civilization has always exposed its soft powers, rediscovers hard power and rediscovers that soft power is not enough to play your role in this world. So let's go through these 7 parameters step by step. And again, I promise you that I will stop at 6:10 so that we can then have an exchange and perhaps go into some more details of these points, because 7 points in about 30 minutes leaves us with about 6 minutes per point. Yes. Diffusion of power. I have to go back a little bit in history. I gave already a hint to that last week. Diffusion of power. That means that power gets diffused all over the world. But let's go back. What kind of world did we live last century, then at the end of last century, beginning of this century, and then today? Well, in big terms, I think the flow is the following. We have had a bipolar world throughout the Cold War. The Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was about a 40-year period. Then we had the Unipolar Moment, as we call it, the sole remaining superpower being the United States. That was from 90, I would say, up to 2012. Let's say short, more or less 20 years, no more, definitely no more. And then as of 2010, I think we are not yet at, but on the road towards a multipolar world. So bipolar, unipolar, multipolar. And I'll explain that a little bit. And now this stage, the stage of the way towards, we are not yet there. We are looking for a new balance of powers. There is a power shift today. This explains the uncertainty and the unpredictability. Countries, states are just testing each other out. They are testing and teasing. Look at the Southeast China Sea and what China is doing there. Those artificial islands. Look at Kim Jong-un with his missiles. Look at Putin with his Crimea adventure and the eastern part of Donbass, and even Syria to some extent. So everybody is testing each other, but I come back to that. Diffusion of power, bipolar world. The Cold War era, this was objectively quite a dangerous place, but it was very predictable. Dangerous, but rather predictable. And that's a paradox. And Ronald Steele, in his book, The Temptations of a Superpower, has the following little sentence. In its perverted way, the Cold War was a force of stability. And there you have the paradox. In its perverted way, the Cold War was a force of stability. You may remember that at that time, that kind of stability, you could almost show it in a picture. If you have the two poles of a magnet and you activate them, and let's say all these are countries, what happens is that there is an almost perfect alignment of all those countries. And let's call this Washington and this Moscow. Then you knew exactly from any country in the world, you knew exactly where their place was. There was a perfect alignment, and that is what I mean with predictability and stability. Take Kinshasa, Mr. Mobutu, This was Washington. We knew he was on that side of the alignment. And just go down 500 kilometers to Luanda, Angola, and you know that this was in the Moscow sphere of influence, if I may say so. So there was a kind of transparency. Everybody knew exactly where you stood. You could go through the map of Africa and Asia, point to a country, everything, everybody could say, this is Washington, this is Moscow, this is Washington, and so on. So that is what we mean with predictability and stability, whereas underlying there was that very serious Cold War nuclear threat, which we wrap up, we, the diplomats and the military, wrap up under that very meaningful label MAD, which stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. So you see the whole paradox of the bipolar world. Thanks to the mutually assured destruction doctrine, we got a lot of stability. I don't know whether there are Belgians in the room, but if there are, they may recall that we had a Minister of Foreign Affairs in the 60s who issued the Hamel Doctrine, and the Hamel Doctrine essentially was also based on some of these points. So that was more or less the situation when we had the Cold War situation. We have all, and then we had, as I said, we had that seizure at the end of the Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall, and so on. And then it seemed to be a free-for-all. That tension, that kind of discipline that you had on the globe disappeared. And what we have seen then in the 90s is a proliferation of all kinds of conflicts, There has been not a more turbulent phase in, let's say, recent history than that as of the 90s. So the control of the system disappeared, and all those forces can go in any direction. And as far as Africa is concerned, for instance, it was quite clear that as of the 90s, there was no strategic interest in Africa anymore. At the time, we cared about Angola, we cared about DRC, called Congo at the time, because we definitely wanted them to keep them in our camp, Washington, or in the other camp, Moscow. But once that bipolar world disappeared, the kind of lid which gave rise to the discipline was off the pot, and all forces were free for all. And then you saw indeed a lot of conflicts arise in Africa, closer to home in the Balkans. Balkans is a quite clear example of what can happen when there is not that lead anymore. All those forces, those devilish forces, spread out, ethnic conflicts which were subdued thanks to the strong regimes, although Yugoslavia was a more liberal regime, as we know, more liberal than the Hungarian, Czechs, Slovaks, and so on. But all these became free and gave rise to a lot of countries. So the disruptive forces were unleashed. They had been held in check by that ordering principle that came out of the Cold War era. And ethnic conflicts and national rivalries, once held in check, erupted in violence. So that is what happened after the collapse. And what you saw is that basically there was one single power emerging in the world. Moscow had dissolved its own power base. You remember the Yeltsin years. In the early 90s, Yeltsin became president, and Yeltsin was very forthcoming with us, was too easy almost. One of the things Putin, because Putin now is kind of taking his revenge on what we, the West, did with Yeltsin. He says you abused of Yeltsin. which is to some extent an exaggeration, because Yeltsin simply was forthcoming. He dealt with us in a rather easy way. That is the time when the NATO-Russia Council was being set up. Just think about it, NATO-Russia Council, which now, as you know, is in the freezer as a result of Putin's invasion, well, occupation and then incorporation of the Crimea, but also troublemaking policies in the eastern part of Ukraine. But at that time, we set up the NATO-Russia Council, something which was unimaginable, of course, at prior times. So that was the Yeltsin era, which means, essentially, they played the game of Washington. There was an alignment on the Washington agenda, including IMF, World Bank, and so on. If you look at the others, China definitely in the early 90s was not yet there. It was the beginning of serious economic growth, but not at all to be compared with the current situation. And we in Europe, because basically when we talk about the world, we talk about the US, Russia, the European Union, and then of course China. These are the four big players. So, US was the sole remaining power because the Russia collapsed. The European Union, notwithstanding the Maastricht Treaty of '92, was still rather hesitant and weak. At some stage, I think we will have to say something about the European Union, where we are today, where we come from. We have a kind of legitimacy, which is very high, but an efficacy, which is somewhat less important. But then, definitely we were not there. And China, again, was not yet there, although the growth started. So the field was essentially free for the US, and that was the unipolar world. People then can discuss, was the US in that position of a sole remaining superpower in that unipolar moment? Have they been acting responsibly or not? Because when you're alone, you kind of are in position to dictate the terms of the debate. That can be discussed, of course. This being said, my personal view is that all by all, they assumed their responsibilities in a correct way. Not everything went the right way, but it's fair to say that we may be happy that we did have the US around. Because if even the US would not have been around, we would come back to what the realists call the anarchic situation. Nobody is there, and it's a situation where everybody goes its own way with all the potential conflicts that this brings with it. So, well, Clinton at that time, I was in Washington at that time, said if the US does not lead, the job won't be done. And I think that's fair. They took a very responsible stance in most of the problems which were to be solved. Then we go to the next stage, and that is there is no data. It's not like saying the 90s or now the 2010s, but as of 2000, 2005, you saw China emerging with growth rates going into the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% economic growth. Political growth is something different, but even politically there were some acts of modernization. You had the Russians slightly coming back. Putin 1, then Medvedev, then Putin 2, clearly taking kind of revenge, as I said, on what we pretendedly did and abused at the time that they collapsed with Yeltsin. Europe starting having an own policy, starting having the Lisbon Treaty, the External Action Service, Madame Mogherini and that kind of things, although still short of a strong one. And that is more or less the situation where we are now. That is that these rising powers are just trying to find a new balance. The Russians with a strong Putin rise strongly, although the power base is a very fragile one. The US more or less remained where it was, although I think there is some less articulate and assertive leadership coming out of the US today than there was, let's say, 10 years ago. And it's not just a question of Trump. Obama also has been a less forceful leader as far as the US is concerned and the role of the US in the world. So Russia goes up, US remains the first and strongest power in the world, but goes down a little. China goes down in a spectacular way, but again, that is not to say that everything will go the right way, because there is a tremendous discrepancy here between the political evolution and the economic evolution. As long as you have growth rates of 8%, you can feed your people with, gadgets every year. Every year is something new, a second television set or what have you, a car. But if your political system doesn't evolve at the same rate in terms of modernization, this may lead to a clash, to a discrepancy, and that is what potentially is dangerous for China. But China definitely is growing and is becoming also a more responsible player on the international stage. And the European Union has, we here in Europe, we went through a very difficult stage. We had one crisis after another, very often made abroad, not endogenic, but exogenic. Take the migration, exogenic, the euro crisis, Wall Street coming over. Of course, we had our intrinsic weaknesses, structural weaknesses, including structural weaknesses, but most of those challenges which we had to face for the last few years, the euro crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit now. Brexit is not really exogenous, but still a little bit. We had those crises. I think we are now at a point where we are seeing for ourselves again things not in a more optimistic way. It's not a question of being pessimist or optimist, but in a way where we got some wake-up calls with those crises, but also some wake-up calls with what the Russians did in Crimea, with what the Chinese are trying to do in Southeast China Sea, Kim Jong-un and so on. Wake-up call, and there is now a consciousness in Europe that we have to have our act together, to get our act together on our own, not always relying on the transatlantic relationship and our transatlantic partner in the US. Also because the US is giving signals to Europe that you should get your act together with your own means. That's the world, and it's a world where nobody has found yet its proper place, its natural place. And that is what explains what I said just a few minutes ago, why there is teasing and testing and teasing. What is my place in this world? And you have little pricks. But intrinsically, I said in the beginning of my lecture, this is not a dangerous world. I think the Cold War world was much more dangerous. It's not a dangerous place. I don't see any signal that we are heading for a major conflict in the foreseeable time. But what it is an extremely uncertain world, an unpredictable world. Nobody knows exactly who will end up where in that new power equation that will emerge out of this configuration. So let me leave that first, but indeed perhaps most important underlying trend for what it is, diffusion of power. I go to the fragmentation of values. I will now hasten a little bit the rhythm of my presentation. Fragmentation of powers, that is essentially something that we see in terms of, for instance, respect for international law. If you go back again 20 years ago, 25 years ago, then there was a kind of, I would say, standard acceptance of certain basic norms, values, and rules of international law, for instance. Such rules as non-use of force, the principle of territorial integrity. These were uncontested. Nobody would have dared to invade except people like Saddam Hussein, which were unpredictable anyway, but a responsible leader, that is particularly any one of these, would never have been expected to forego the respect of the UN Charter and the principle enshrined in the Charter, such as respect for borders, territorial integrity, protection of civilians in armed conflict, non-use of force, and that kind of things. And what we have witnessed now, just recently, a couple of years ago, is that these principles, the principles of rule of law, of democracy, are indeed being set aside, and that is what some of us call the post-Cold War era, where the rules-based system that we knew until then is now kind of fragmenting out, fragmentation of the values. We don't have a stable rules-based system anymore. Some respect the rules as we do, others do not respect it, others do it sometimes yes, sometimes no, according to an opportunistic agenda. The same is true for the political rights and the fundamental freedoms, freedom of the press, conduct of free and fair elections, fair trial. Just think, for instance, at what is currently happening in Turkey, where I think we are witnessing a rather critical situation in terms of respecting basic human rights and values, fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of press. We have just seen what happened with one of those prominent human rights defenders who had a very high standing, including here in Brussels, where he has been invited a couple of times by the European Parliament. He spoke before very important assemblies, and now he finds himself back in jail. So human rights and all that kind of things. There is a kind of what you could wrap that up, that story of the fragmentation of values, by saying that essentially, whereas there was a kind of agreement on universalism, at the time there were universal values, and we speak about the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and that kind of things, that there is now a kind of, instead of a universalism, there is a particularism. Everybody cuts his own human rights and basic principles of, freedom of press and so on, according to how it suits him. And then you have, of course, stories that you can build around that. You have the classical criticism that the human rights are a Western invention anyway, and then you have the story, the nice story of the Asian values. And I don't want to ridicule that. There is a truth to the fact that the human rights are essentially Western-made. Look at history. 18th century, the century of the Enlightenment, is a Western phenomenon. It's almost a French phenomenon. And from there, the whole discourse of human rights has arisen and then found its legitimation, if I may say so, in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights of 48 in the framework of the United Nations. So it is made in the West, but that's not enough. That's too short a story. Although it's made in the West, still they reflect principles of universal aspiration. And just saying that there is something like Western human rights and Asian human rights is perhaps a little bit too short. But you see that emerging, increasing criticism about the ethnocentrism of the human rights, the way we interpret those human rights not being in conformity with what it is. And politicians, and I can witness that firsthand, have increasingly a difficult job making the case of human rights. When you now go, for instance, in Rwanda, you meet with Kagame, and you tell him, look, you are a good manager, you made a fantastic job in your country in terms of development, and Kagame is a very smart guy indeed, and a responsible guy at that, but still he did it by the way of having a rather authoritarian regime installed. And then you raise problems of human rights, it's very difficult. You get at once put on your place in terms of who are you to come to tell me what I have to do? My country is running well, and you in the European Union, you got your euro crisis, you have your banks that collapse, and that's the kind of aggressive style of answer you get, and then you add something like ethnocentrism, African values, and so on. The same is true for Saudi Arabia, for instance, where it becomes very difficult to make the case of human rights, because then they start indeed making you a story about this is just Western stuff and we are different from you. So that is why I like to wrap that up under the label from universalism to particularism. Particularism, which essentially means each is owner of his own truths and values. And when you say that each is owner of his own truths, we are very close, of course, at the so-called post-truth era, of which Trump speaks from time to time, and at the so-called alternative facts. Third trend. So first trend, diffusion of power. Second trend, fragmentation of values. Third trend, the return to bilateralism. Now, this can be a short story. We all know that after the Second World War, there was a kind of very serious attempt to make sure that the order in the world would be maintained through a cooperative model. And that cooperative model stands for multilateralism. And of course, the epitome of that multilateral cooperation was the United Nations, after the failure of the League of Nations after the First World War. But that was in part also connected to the Treaty of Versailles, which was an ill-conceived treaty, a punitive treaty, that in fact set the seeds for the Second World War. So that the League of Nations was not a success was not was not a surprise at all. But then we get that new mentality. Cooperation is the model, multilateralism is the solution. And some of you may know that we in Belgium, we are almost congenital multilateralists. There are other considerations that also play for being that, but it is definitely believing in a model of cooperation. When I say there are other reasons also, there is a kind of cost-benefit analysis. When you are a smaller country, and some of you come from larger countries, when you are smaller countries, multilateralism pays. When you are a large country, multilateralism still pays, but to a lesser extent. It's clear that for the United States, being multilateral is not an existential question. For a country like ours, Belgium, it is an existential question. With existential, I don't mean that we are going to die because there is no multilateral system. What I mean is that we lose any lever to play in an incisive way on the world governance. Now, that multilateralism and that kind of credo, because it was more than just a calculation, it was also a commitment to a certain philosophy of international relations. That philosophy should be based on understanding and cooperation, not on competition. You remember last week that I said that there is a binomial there. You can enter the world stage in a competitive way, power politics, raw power politics. You can enter it, and the prisoner's dilemma is quite significant in that sense, in a cooperative spirit. And as we know, a cooperative spirit ends up with a win-win in your prisoner's dilemma, whereas a competitive ends up with a lose-lose. So there was a kind of philosophy, and many people shared that philosophy of multilateralism with its collective disciplines, with its behaving and predictability, the rules-based system, international law. International law essentially is there to make the behavior of the others predictable, so that you know what you can expect from the others and what you cannot expect from the others. So all this rules-based system, international law, multilateralism goes together. And what you see in the last few years, I would say the last 10 years, it is that there is a growing distancing from multilateral organization. Multilateralism is not a very sexy concept, I would say. It was very sexy 20 years ago. Today, when you say, I'm a convinced multilateralist, you may have some people who say, look, are you still that naive guy that believes in effective multilateralism, as we called it in the Solana strategy of 2003? You have to be strong. It's only bilateral policy that pays. And you see those trends. For instance, William Hague, who was, as you recall, the Foreign Secretary in the UK with the Foreign Office, with the Cameroon government that was elected in May 2010. William Hague, a historian, read a lot about history and how it plays out. And he came out with the concept. It's not a revolutionary concept, but it's a totally new concept of what he called the new bilateralism. We here in the United Kingdom, dear people, we stand for new bilateralism. And the old-fashioned multilateralism, which is cozy, which is nice, you like each other, we understand each other, you appreciate each other. It's a nice world, but this world that you plead for, but this world is a rather tough place. And I, William Hague, and we, the Cameroon government, we know that the survival value of bilateralism brings you further than multilateralism. And that was the new bilateralism. And you have seen that in some other countries also arising, such as, for instance, Hungary, other countries, including in Europe. You have a kind of not dismemberment, but a kind of alienation in the periphery of some countries that don't really fit in the core values of the European Union, that do want to go to some extent their own way, that question the multilateral compact, if I may say so, and that is to be seen in different ways. Also, the reverse, of course, of if you go for a new bilateralism, then you see that the kind of multilateralism is diminishing. And I'm just referring, for instance, to Trump. Trump also is clearly a new bilateralist. He says it openly. And a clear signal was given 10 days ago when the United States withdrew from UNESCO. Well, UNESCO is not nothing. I mean, it's not the most supreme, most powerful, most important international organization, but still, the fact that the United States withdraw of such a multilateral organization is not nothing. They already left about 20 years ago the UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. I would say rightly so, because this was a totally old-fashioned organization. The development of the world was quite different from what that organization stood. And as you know, most of these organizations just want to keep themselves alive. You can't say that from UNESCO. UNESCO, who cares for children, who cares for science, for patrimonium, cultural patrimonium. Again, I don't pretend that that is the most important organization, but still. But it's symptomatic. The same is true for the threat of President Trump that he would diminish his obligatory contribution to the UN budget with, and that is what he said, with 40%. Now, as you know, there is always a distinction to be made between what the president says and what really happens. And fortunately for all of us, that space, that gap between what Mr. Trump says and what actually happens is rather large. And it's a good thing. So he talks a lot, but in the real world, we see that the stabilizers of the American democracy work rather well, and that shows also the strength of a democracy, how strong institutions have a life on their own. Politicians may not like that too much, but that is really the difference between a state and a nation. A state has institutions, and institutions are stabilizers. Whereas a nation has a big boss, and the boss says, and the boss thinks, and the boss has a philosophy, and the boss has an approach. All right, that was 3. The return of bilateralism. 4, short-termism. This is, as I said, I do not want to exaggerate that point, but it's apparent. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, politicians essentially were there to think about the long term, and that is what they had to do. You have a government, not for the nitty-gritty of every day. That can be handled by, non-governmental organizations, associations of all kinds of things. But you need a government to give a line in your policy. Of course, they have to manage points, but at least they must know where they want to land. They must have a clear objective. And that objective sometimes has to weight your country through difficult times, because people may be sometimes not quite happy with that direction, but at the long term it is what pays. And what you see now is that politicians tend to reason much more in short-term terms. That is, I do this because it pleases the people, I do that because it pleases some other fragment or segment of society. And so, in fact, you go from one place to another without having that long-term objective in your mind. Now, to the extent that the big challenges of this world are long-term challenges, this kind of ad hocery, going from one point to another, short-term thinking is rather dangerous. Some people say that the main reason, and I think they are right, the main reason that we have so much short-termism in politics is that the deadlines, that there are a lot of electoral deadlines, and that's true. A politician, in fact, is campaigning the whole of his life. He has just gotten out of one election, he has already to start to think about the next election. And if you have a system that is a multi-layered system, a multi-level governance system, as you have in Germany, but particularly, for instance, in Belgium, then you are always campaigning, always, every day, because either it's European elections, okay, I campaign. Then it's regional elections, okay, I am again campaigning. Municipal elections, then of course national elections. And so you're always campaigning. So democracy is strong because there are lots of elections. And elections are important because you have to renew the blood that goes through your political system. You have to renew the political personnel because they have to stand for what you stand for and not for their own career. But then again, the accumulation of deadlines as a result also of these multi-level governance structures leads to a situation where the politician, although he knows that this should be the end point of his policy, ends up doing this because he wants to survive as a political animal. So this is a touchy issue on which we have to think. Some people, political scientists, really are very much concerned by that, and even question whether our democratic model, as we know it, is still appropriate for the kind of world in which we live. Because the world in which we live, it's long-term problems that are the real problems. What are long-term problems? Climate change, pension regimes, because we are talking about intergenerational solidarity. It's very good that the old people now have nice pensions, but the funds will be empty by the time the next generation comes up. So these are intrinsically long-term. The same is true for an industrial policy, for a labor policy. All this is not something that you quickly fix in 2 years, 3 years government time. This is a long-term process. And if your domestic politics, as a result of those electoral deadlines, is very much focused on the short term, then you lose sight of what the real crises are. Now, by the way, it's a footnote. By the way, we can sometimes be happy that we have international organizations that keep track of those long-term objectives, because that is what they can. Take the United Nations. I've been working in the United Nations for about 6 years. Take the United Nations, and I have a lot of criticism, so I'm not in an exercise of complacency here. I'm just in an exercise of trying to see how this world turns around. Ban Ki-moon, he got his second term. Did he deserve it? Personally, some people have been questioning that. But the point is that Ban Ki-moon did not have an electoral deadline. Yes, there was a second term, and all Secretary Generals have a second term, but that was not necessarily something like a deadline you have in national politics. What is important for an international organization is that they don't have that kind of turbulence of electoral, fever, and they can look at the end term of what it is. And I want to make a double point. International organizations are good in norm setting. They are good at that kind of work, norm setting. They are not good at, say, conflict management. And the point is that sometimes we mix up these two things. So I would say here, don't expect long-term things from a short-term government. Do expect it from them. But conflict management, that is something that you have to address in the short term. You have to have decision-making processes that are quick and effective and intrusive, and that is where you have to do that, not here. I give an example. Is the United Nations a good conflict manager? No, except for the Security Council. Is the European Union a good conflict manager? I'm not sure. Look at when we have to address a conflict, it goes straight to the member states. It's the member states who have the ownership of conflict management. It's Germany, it's France. It's a call between Mr. Hollande and Merkel, between Macron and Merkel, perhaps at the time triangular with the UK even in. UK is now out. That is the way it works, because it's an ownership of the membership and a decision-making process that at the level of the membership can work well, but not at the level of international organizations. So that is what I wanted to say on short-termism. Yes?
Weren't there 20 years ago, weren't there also the same multilateral democratic elections?
Yeah, but I think the sensitivity of the politicians for these deadlines and the expectations of the people also, of the electorate, have changed. The electorate, with all due respect, wants to have immediate gratification. Whereas 20 years ago, the electorate, and you would have had a politician who 20 years ago came out with such a story, and I'm thinking particularly for the Belgians around, at people like Mr. Tindemans at the time. Mr. Tindemans could sell in his national elections this story, the kind of long-term story. Because there was traction. At that time, there was traction in the population for that kind of stories, the kind of visionary story, the kind of long-term story. We go for, say, peace and security. Today you say, I stand for peace and security, you won't go very far in winning your next elections. You better talk about taxation, about borders and migration and that kind of stuff. Now, this being said, in all the 7 points, or what is it that I'm trying to illustrate here, I'm a little bit putting things in extreme forms as a caricature just for the sake of clarity, because all this can be worked out, of course, with some more details. I go to the next point, a lack of world leadership, or at least a reluctance of leaders to assume their responsibilities. We don't have world leaders as we had in former times, and that could be not just of the United States or Russia or what is it. It could be of countries like Indonesia or Singapore or Egypt. What you had is that you had people who really cared about world governance, who were not just there to care about their local stuff, their national stuff, but who took part in international conferences, big congresses and that kind of things, and assumed their responsibilities. Today you have a kind of retreat, and I come back, that's my next point, isolationism. You have a kind of retreat out of that global world to each of them their own position. And of course you look particularly at what I would call responsible leaders. And as I already said, European Union and the US are those to whom very often we look when we look for responsible leaders. And here, not yet the traction. Well, to some extent, we have been, in the European Union, we have been neutralizing our own leaders. I may come back to that when I speak about Europe. But there is something in the European Union construction that is paradoxical. That is that to the extent that you transfer your powers, part of your sovereignty, to the supranational level, you don't have them anymore. And you kind of disown yourself. You disown yourself of a responsibility that now has become supranational. Whereas the supranational level can't play the role yet. We know that President Tusk, President Van Rompuy, was not just a peer of Obama or of Xi or the Chinese leaders before Xi. So we kind of disempower the national leadership to empower a supranational leadership, but the supranational leadership is not yet there, not fully there. You have the European Council, but the European Council doesn't stand really for a leader that you can just put next to Obama or next to Trump. And that is something that Obama was complaining about. He says, well, you remember Kissinger, who said, what's the telephone number of the European Union? Obama said something similar. He said, why go to a US-European summit? I meet there Juncker, I meet there Tusk, I meet there Van Rompuy, who is it? I want to meet the German leader, Madame Merkel, given her influence in Europe politics. And he couldn't do that because the European Union is what it is. It was through the leadership, the tripartite leadership, that he had to speak. But there is also, it's not just that institutional reasons are there for that weakened leadership. There's also something like people not really willing to assume a leadership role. And I think in the US, for instance, we have felt that particularly for the last few years with Obama. Obama was much more discreet than the former leaders. Think about Clinton, who was an outspoken, outreaching president who took his responsibilities worldwide, as I already said. Obama, after the Bush years, of course, which were a little bit adventurous in certain respects, wanted to retreat a little bit again inside and be be a prudent man. And being a prudent man is, of course, not necessarily what you expect from a world leader. We've also seen that in the US actions in Libya, where there was a lot of reticence on behalf of the Americans to come into the game. They led, as they said, from behind, but not in front. In Syria, we have seen how three red lines were being broken consecutively and no action ensued on behalf of the American leadership, which of course is rather critical if you want to be taken seriously by the others. Nothing is undermining your authority more than not living up to your threats, and that is something on which we come back when we will be talking about the use of force. When you make a threat of use of force and consecutively you don't act on that threat, when, for instance, your conditions, your red lines have not been respected, have been broken, then you undermine all your authority. And Obama, I think, in his second term, has felt the fallout of his not having respected his own red lines. Leadership, it's not for the Russians at this stage to assume their leadership, because this is not a responsible leadership. When we talk about leadership, we mean responsible leadership. That is why I was essentially focusing on US and European Union. The Russians, they may be willing to assume leadership, but not necessarily a responsible leadership, perhaps leadership to make a situation more difficult than it already is. And the Chinese are not yet there. As we probably will have the opportunity to say later on in one of the classes, the Chinese definitely are increasingly assuming their part of responsibility. They were essentially, as you know, free riders until a couple of years ago. Until 10 years ago, they basically said, the US, the European Union, these are responsible people. They make sure there is order in this world, and we are the free riders, and we hide behind the NAM and the G77. You know, the NAM, non-aligned movement, G77, these are those big groupings within the world community, particularly the United Nations, with a kind of distant ideology. And what the Chinese did, instead of assuming the responsibility, they just hide behind the non-aligned movement and the G77, which was a rather comfortable position. I don't assume my responsibilities. In the meantime, the US and the European Union is making sure that this world is more or less an orderly place, and I go for the growth of my economy and that kind of thing. As I said today, definitely that free riding is finished. We've seen that in some of the new actions taken by the Chinese leadership, including, for instance, just recently, their reaction, their rather constructive reaction as far as North Korea is concerned, where there is a minimum understanding between Washington and Beijing that something has to be done about North Korea. I go to the sixth point, growing isolationism. I don't go into details. We all have seen that there is a withdrawal out of the kind of global world and an inward-looking tendency in a lot of countries. We see it in the United States, of course, with Trump, a growing isolationism. But we see it also in Europe, with countries like Hungary, like Slovakia, like Poland, where there is a withdrawal from the world at large towards the co-safety within the national borders, which then engenders nationalism, xenophobia, and that kind of thing. Aggressive nationalism. Identitarian policies are the result of that withdrawal and of that transition from an outward-looking way of behaving towards an inward-looking way. American first, protectionism. Just look at the measures which are in the tax law, in the draft tax law that is now on the table in Washington. the anti-globalism tendencies with Madame Le Pen in France and other far-right or far-left movements that are definitely against reaching out towards the world as a whole. And finally, there is that return of power politics, which wraps up a little bit the whole story. Return of politics, that is, I think, rather clear. And of course, it is linked to the fact that we got out of multilateralism. It is linked to that uncertainty in the world with diffusion of power. It is linked to the fragmentation of values. But as the post-Cold War rules-based world order is increasingly and openly being questioned, we see that people start realizing that history has not come to an end, contrary to Fukuyama, who said the end of history is not there. History, this is something we learned now with the new developments, history is reversible. Safety is not taken to be granted. Safety is something that you have to work on every and each day. We've seen that what happened at the eastern border of Europe, Ukraine, Crimea, 2008, Georgia, where there was a flagrant displacement of the basic rules of international behavior, invasion of a country, use of force and that kind of things. So there is a kind of return of power politics, not saying raw power politics, but power politics, yes. And what is interesting is that even within the European Union, there is a kind of hard power politics thinking coming back. I personally, I'm not against that, because I think that we in the European Union, we have for too long a period believed slightly naively, I think, that this world was a kind of nice place. And we got some wake-up calls with what happened with Russia, with what happened with China in the South China Sea, with North Korea and other places. And these wake-up calls, also the signal coming out of the US from put your act together, assume your own responsibilities, has been a wake-up call that we say, look, the world is perhaps not that nice a place. We were proud about our soft power, and we thought that it would be an immunizing element around Europe, that we would be immune for foreign negative influences because we were so civilized with our power of attraction, as we call it, with the soft power. And now we realize that something more than soft power, I say something more of soft power. We keep the soft power, of course, but something more than soft power is required, and that is hard power. That doesn't mean the brutal, raw power that some people are speaking about when you speak about power politics. We have to be prudent in using that terminology, but there is some strategic thinking coming back to the place. Look at Putin, look at Erdogan, look at Kim Jong-un, look at Mr. Trump. If these are the people with whom you have to deal, you'd better also stylistically try to be a little bit, not like them, but at least stylistically assume a new style of doing diplomacy and making sure that your own interests are being taken care of. I'll keep it at this point, and I turn to you for possible questions. We have about 10 minutes left.